Nobody leaves a chair empty unless they believe the man it was meant for no longer matters. But when Arnold Schwarzenegger laid his hand on that black folder, the entire room, from Mike Johnson to the quietest staffer, began to understand: truth doesn't need volume. It only needs presence. It began with the wrong name on the desk. It ended with no one daring to speak. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The chamber was already full. Not with noise, but with something heavier. A silence thick enough to scrape against bone. Rows of congressional aides typed without urgency. Cameras blinked from high-mounted rigs. A faint mechanical hum from the overhead lights floated over everything like static too old to fix. There was no laughter. No chatter. Only the low shuffling of papers and the click of a pen being capped and uncapped, again and again, by someone near the center dais. The door opened. Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped inside. Not as a politician. Not as a movie star. Just a man carrying something too old to explain, and too dignified to perform. No one looked up. He moved slowly, not out of weakness, but calculation. Every step measured as if the room might misinterpret speed as arrogance, or slowness as irrelevance. He paused by the first row of seats. A congressman, mid-50s, press suit, bipartisan lapel pin, stood less than a meter away. Arnold offered his hand. It was subtle. Unforced. Palm open, weight steady, gesture quiet. The congressman adjusted his folder. No glance. No nod. Just a deliberate pivot away. A performance of ignorance that said more than rejection ever could. Arnold let his hand hover for 1 second longer than necessary. Then withdrew it. No change in expression. No muscle twitched. He simply turned and continued toward the far end of the table. His seat waited. It wasn't near the MIC. It wasn't near the committee. It was near the shadow line cast by the edge of the gallery light, where the marble caught no reflection and the carpet held no heat. There, on the lacquered surface, sat a nameplate. Wrong. Mr. Schwartz. Not a typo. Not a clerical slip. A choice. No middle initial. No title. No context. Arnold stood before the plate for a beat too long, not reading it, but letting it be seen. Letting the cameras catch it, because they would. He pulled the chair back. No one offered to help. He removed a single glove from his right hand. Black leather, worn smooth at the knuckles. Placed it to his left side. Then, with the same care, set down a hard-edged, unmarked black folder. Its corners slightly frayed. Its presence. Deliberate. Then, the pause. Arnold didn't sit. He looked down at the lapel of his jacket. A faint glint under the chamber lights revealed a silver pin, no larger than a thumbnail. Presidential Recovery Delegate, a relic title from a previous administration. Appointed to oversee national economic rehabilitation. Forgotten by most. Not removed by him. He looked at it, not with nostalgia, not with sentiment, but with calculation. Letting it remind the room and the camera of something that could not be said aloud. This country once asked me to help it heal. And now it seats me in the shadows. Saturday. His spine didn't touch the backrest. His hands didn't fidget. One rested near the folder. The other, open, uncurled, hovered over the table's edge like it was waiting for history to reach out and shake it. No one did. A page clipped a stack of papers. A camera blinked. The door at the other end opened. Johnson entered. Applause. Not thunderous. Not accidental. But orchestrated. A few Republican aides rose. A smattering of claps echoed, strategically spread like sonar, sending signals more than praise. Johnson walked in like he'd been briefed on every camera angle. He smiled like a man who knew what wasn't going to be said today. He didn't look at Arnold. He didn't have to. The message was already sent. This is my room. And your relevance ended 2 administrations ago. Arnold didn't move. He didn't blink. But his hand, the one near the folder, curled just slightly inward. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to store memory. From across the room, A junior aide whispered something into a cuff-linked sleeve. A senator adjusted her chair. No one addressed him. No one called him governor. No one said welcome. The hearing was about to begin. But for Arnold, the silence had already said enough. And in that silence, a folder sat still. A hand waited. A pin glinted. And across the chamber, a nameplate still spelled him wrong. It began with 6 words. Arnold had waited. Silently. Precisely. The way only a man who had seen too many rooms like this could wait. And then, when finally acknowledged by the committee chair, he leaned forward. Calm. Composed. Fingers steepled just above the black folder, still unopened. He began, with respect to Section 17B of, that was all he got. The gavel hit. Crack. Not a tap. Not procedural. A deliberate punctuation, the kind meant to interrupt more than sound. Speaker Mike Johnson didn't even look up as he struck. His hand was already retreating when he spoke. Let's stop right there, Mr. Schwarzenegger, he said, slow and deliberate, his voice coiled in mock civility. Before we get another monologue from the Terminator on infrastructure policy. A pause. A chuckle. From somewhere in the Republican aisle, not loud, but perfectly timed, a ripple of laughter began. Not uncontrolled. Not spontaneous. It was the kind of laugh that's been practiced. Passed down. Someone, a woman in a red jacket 2 rows back, turned to the person beside her and whispered just loud enough for a boom MIC to catch. Classic. Laughter spread. Not because it was funny, but because it was safe to laugh. Johnson continued, his voice just a little louder now, soaking in the rhythm of performance. We're here to address federal appropriations, not reboot a movie franchise. Scattered smirks. A few quiet snorts. Papers shuffled on cue. The tempo had changed. The room had aligned. It wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a roast. And Arnold, without ever raising his voice, had been made the punchline. Johnson adjusted his cufflinks. Eyes still low, playing disinterest. This isn't Hollywood, Mr. Schwarzenegger. We don't vote with one-liners. That one landed. Another flicker of amusement from the crowd, this time from someone on the outer edge of the gallery. A delayed ripple. The kind of approval that builds consensus, not noise. Arnold didn't react. Not a twitch. Not a blink. But his eyes, they moved. Slowly. Deliberately. They rose from the folder. Past the table. Past the laughter. Up. Into the glare of the overhead lighting. The kind of fluorescence used in hospital rooms and interrogation chambers. Harsh. Surgical. Unforgiving. He stared into it for 2 full seconds. The camera caught it, a direct shot from the rear right angle, isolating only his face and the cone of sterile white light above him. Then, he lowered his gaze. Back to the table. Back to the folder. One hand resting gently on the leather spine. He didn't speak. And that was louder than any rebuttal. A subtle camera cut to Johnson, who, for half a breath, shifted in his chair. He glanced briefly at Arnold, expecting eye contact. None came. So he tried again. With all due respect, Johnson said, words laced in mock gravitas, this committee needs substance. Not slogans. Another laugh, thinner now, forced from the man to his right, who looked down immediately afterward. Arnold's posture didn't move. But his fingers? They tapped once on the folder. Then stopped. Silence returned. Not because it was invited, but because it had outlasted the joke. Even the cameras, auto-panning every 5 seconds, seemed to slow. Johnson cleared his throat. No one echoed him this time. The room, once energized by ridicule, now hovered in an awkward stillness, the kind that lingers when a performance has gone on just one sentence too long. And Arnold, still, quiet, unblinking, sat beneath the heat of 1,000-watt truth. He had just been publicly reduced. Dismissed by name. Laughed at by design. But he didn't break. Didn't rise. Didn't fight. Because this room, loud, smug, rehearsed, had done something far worse than insult him. It had declared its side. And he was writing that down. Not in a notebook. Not in words. But in memory. Burned into light. Etched into silence. Waiting. Not for vengeance. For timing. The hearing resumed, or pretended to. Johnson turned back to his prepared notes. Delivered cue cards shuffled into place beside him like the limbs of a machine realigning. Words about fiscal oversight. Phrases about responsibility. Familiar music for a room that no longer needed to listen. Most faces turned forward. Arnold did not. He didn't flinch. Didn't clear his throat. Didn't interrupt. He just Saturday. Unmoving. Unblinking. A single figure under surgical lighting, surrounded by microphones that weren't his, in a chamber that didn't want his voice, only his silence. And so, for now, he gave it. But the silence wasn't compliance. It was compression. His right hand reached forward slowly, not aggressively, not theatrically, and opened the black folder on the table before him. 2 pages. Marked. Tightly clipped in a thin metal fastener. He looked at them as if reviewing something already memorized, not for confirmation, but for calibration. Then, slowly, precisely, he closed the folder again. The click of the cover meeting the table was almost imperceptible. And then, with a movement so minimal it nearly escaped the lens, Arnold nodded. Not to anyone. Not in agreement. Just a short, personal nod, as if to mark something internally. A clock ticking from not yet to almost. He folded his hands. Let them rest. Still no words. Still no motion beyond what was chosen. It was then, during that lull, that unbroken quiet, that something cracked from the other side of the table. Not a sound. A sentence. Off mic, unscripted. Barely above a murmur. Johnson, leaning toward a staffer and thinking no one was paying attention, muttered with a smirk, "Jesus, it's like babysitting a statue." The words hit the air and hung there. Not loud enough to make the transcript. But just loud enough to catch. A camera operator, instinctively tracking shifts in room rhythm, caught it on a directional mic. And so did someone else. 2 seats to Johnson's left, a mid-level Democratic representative, mid-40s, reserved, mostly silent, flicked his eyes toward Arnold. Just for a second. Not pity. Not shock. Recognition. The kind of look a soldier gives a statue, not because it's cold, but because it's still standing when the noise around it has tried everything else. Internal camera shift. A slow zoom into the congressman's face. No dialogue. Just the sound of the room continuing without realizing it had just stumbled. Johnson didn't notice the gaze. He was too busy performing again. His voice rose with the next sentence, returning to the floor's rhythm, something about public trust and transparent funding pipelines. Arnold didn't react. But something had changed. Not in him, in the air around him. The laughter from earlier no longer held a grip. The echoes didn't bounce. The jokes didn't stick. Because the room was beginning to realize, the joke hadn't landed. The statue hadn't cracked. And worse. It might have been watching the whole time. Might have been listening. Might have been waiting. The woman in the red jacket, the same one who whispered classic during the laughter, glanced over her shoulder toward Arnold. Just a glimpse. Just long enough for discomfort to show. Not guilt. Not yet. But doubt. He hadn't spoken in minutes. But the weight of his silence was beginning to curve the posture of everyone else. And the irony was sharp. They had tried to shrink him with silence. But now, their noise was shrinking beneath his stillness. Johnson pressed forward, unaware. Another paragraph. Another point. His voice filled the space, but his words didn't. They floated, untethered. And across from him, Arnold remained as before. Folder closed. Hands folded. Eyes steady. The weight of it all now shifting, not with volume, but with gravity. He didn't need a comeback. He was building something more dangerous. Anticipation. And it had begun to coil. For the first time in 17 minutes, Arnold reached forward. No announcement. No throat clearing. No request for permission. Just motion, slow and unignorable. The black folder reopened. The same one he'd shut with deliberate calm minutes earlier. He slid a single sheet from within. The paper was matte. Thick stock. Black and white except for one thing. A single red underline, made not with a computer, but by hand. Uneven. Slightly slanted. Human. Arnold placed the sheet flat on the table, then looked toward the technician controlling the overhead projector. No gesture. Just a glance. And the slide changed. A new image filled the monitors on every desk. The public gallery saw it too, now displayed on the corner feeds. A scanned document, stripped of branding but unmistakable in layout. A government procurement report. Mid-page, a paragraph highlighted in soft yellow. Below it, a single clause. Underlined in red. Funds may be redirected at state discretion pending regional override clause. The line throbbed under the projector's white light. The room didn't gasp. No one moved. Arnold didn't speak. But the document did. A ripple. Eyes narrowed. Necks leaned. Someone exhaled too sharply. Johnson stiffened in his seat, recalibrating. For a moment, he didn't seem to know where to look. The corners of his mouth twitched, not quite a frown, not yet denial. Then, from the Republican side of the aisle, a voice. Not loud. Not accusatory. Just confused. A male voice, low and cautious. Wait, is that the March contract? The kind of question that doesn't look for an answer. The kind meant for a backroom, not a broadcast. But it was too late. It had landed. And it wasn't directed at Arnold. It was pointed, unintentionally, reflexively, at Johnson. Johnson's head turned slightly toward the voice. He didn't respond. Didn't deny. Didn't move. Silence now returned, but not the same kind. This one had friction. Wait. Like silence between two slamming doors. Arnold remained still. Hands folded again. He wasn't amplifying the document. He didn't need to. The slide did the work. That red underline, crude and unmistakably human, held the entire room in its crosshairs. The kind of mark made by someone who wasn't annotating, but circling something they couldn't unsee. On screen, the cursor blinked over the line. No one touched it, but the projection flickered, not technically, but morally. The clause had been there for months. Voted on. Dispersed. Buried. Now it was back. Visible. Embarrassing. And Arnold had drawn no sword. Just a line. A voice from the back coughed, then tried to cover it by shifting in their seat. Another staffer moved to whisper, then thought better of it. No one wanted to interrupt. Because no one knew what would follow. That was the new terror. It wasn't the data. It was the lack of reaction. The usual script had failed. There was no booming accusation. No finger-pointing. No demand for explanation. Just a single question, still unanswered, is that the March contract? And still, Johnson had not replied. His fingers tapped once on his desk. Then stopped. His jaw tightened. His left eye twitched, involuntary, subtle, but not invisible. Camera 2 caught it in a tight mid-shot, the flicker of fight or flight behind composure. The instant where a polished face forgets what it's hiding. Then came the pivot, not from Johnson, but from the room itself. The quiet rearranged. Not by volume, but by mass. The moral center of the room, just minutes earlier anchored behind Johnson's gavel, now began to lean. Like a table leg shifting under weight. No one had switched sides. But no one was sure they wanted to be seen sitting on his. Arnold didn't gloat. Didn't clarify. Didn't even look at Johnson. His eyes stayed on the screen, as if he too was still reading. Still verifying. Still letting the line speak for itself. There were no theatrics. No triumphant tone shift. Just a document. A mark. A question with no owner. And a silence thick enough to cut, but too sacred to break. The technician, unsure whether to move on or hold the slide, looked to Arnold for instruction. He didn't blink. The image stayed up. One more beat. Then another. Then finally, gently, Arnold leaned forward and flipped the page to the next. The next audio clip didn't begin with a voice. It began with a click. That soft, metallic snap of a recording being armed, the kind that most people wouldn't notice unless they were the ones trying to hide. No announcement. No build-up. Just that sound, followed by silence. Then came the voice. Not read aloud. Not paraphrased. But played back, exactly as it had been spoken. Mike Johnson's voice. Clear. Casual. Confident. We'll push it through under the March clause. They'll sign it before they notice what they've lost. Then static. Then silence again. No defense. No edit. No context offered. Just the raw cut. It didn't scream. It didn't need to. It knew the room was already listening. Camera 3 caught the slow ripple of posture shifts along the panel. A female aide blinked. Once, then again. A junior senator leaned forward, not to speak, but to verify that he had indeed heard what everyone else just did. The voice on the tape had no hesitation. No regret. No ambiguity. It was not the voice of policy. It was the voice of strategy. And it was Johnson's. Across the aisle, someone removed their glasses and set them down, not to clean them, but to see more clearly. Arnold didn't move. He wasn't even facing Johnson anymore. His eyes were locked on the table. Not looking. Listening. The clip had ended. But its weight hadn't. Then it happened. Stage left. Second row. Independent Senator Harrow, not aligned with either majority or minority caucus, reached up and removed his earpiece. Slowly. Not as a protest. But as a surrender. He placed it in his coat pocket. Then stood. No words. No dramatic exit. Just a man walking away from a sound he refused to keep listening to. The camera followed him, not as a spectacle, but as a reckoning. A reverse tracking shot. No music. Just the ambient creak of leather seats and the faint hum of the projection monitors. Behind him, no one called out. No one stopped him. No one moved to replace his chair. Because everyone understood what had just happened, a man had heard the system's voice and walked away from it. Seconds later, another shift, subtler, but equally damning. A Republican staffer placed their tablet down. Then reached for their mic. Not to speak, but to lay it down. Gently. Facing down. Like a hand turned over in defeat. 2 gestures. No words. But both said the same thing. This is no longer defendable. The lighting hadn't changed. But the room felt darker. Johnson still hadn't spoken. His body had shifted, arms now crossed tightly, the lines at his temples more visible, jaw flexed just enough to betray the calculation happening behind the silence. But there was no rebuttal to be made. His voice had spoken already. The sentence, "They'll sign it before they notice what they've lost," hung like rust in the air. It wasn't just arrogance. It was architecture. Pre-planned. Pre-executed. Pre-recorded. And now, exposed. Arnold reached forward and closed the folder again. Not sharply. Not symbolically. Just, finally. There were no closing statements. No dramatics. No raised voices. Because the blow had already landed. And it had come from inside the house. Back row, someone coughed. A real cough. No subtext. But it felt like punctuation. The silence that followed was no longer ambient. It was conclusive. Not the silence of what happens next, but of what cannot be undone. From the far right camera rail, one final shot. Arnold, back in frame, from behind this time, his shoulders unmoved, head bowed slightly, hands resting on the closed folder. In the background, chairs remain filled. But no one shifts. No one speaks. And at the edge of the room, the door Harrow walked through still slowly swings shut. The audio doesn't fade to black. It just keeps running. With nothing left but breath. The lights dimmed, not fully, just enough for the projection screen to draw the room's attention again. No voice announced the next slide. No button visibly pressed. Just a quiet shift, an inevitability now. A white page blinked onto the screen. Centered, under a header marked Internal Compliance Summary, was a single bolded line: Vendor diversion confirmed, MJ instructed. There was no footnote, no watermark, no redaction bar to hide behind. Just 6 words. Enough to rewrite a session. Enough to expose the architecture. At the panel table, a legal aid leaned back, face frozen between confusion and recognition. Across the room, the breath of the crowd compressed, not gasped, not muttered, just pulled in. Because this time, it wasn't about what Mike Johnson said. It was about what he built. The slide remained on screen, unmoving, as if daring someone, anyone, to blink first. And someone did. Johnson's chief counsel, a younger man in a pinstripe suit, sweat beginning to gather along his collar, leaned forward toward the MIC. His voice didn't rise in anger. It rose in survival. We'd like to clarify the date on that entry. That wasn't. Arnold didn't turn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean into the microphone. He didn't interrupt with a word. He simply raised his hand, palm open, facing outward, not toward the speaker, but toward the space between them, as if to say, no more. No gesture could have been smaller. None could have been louder. The counsel stopped mid-sentence. Not cut off, halted. The hand didn't tremble. It didn't point. It simply existed in air, like a gate, like a verdict. The cameras didn't pan to Arnold's face. They didn't need to. The room was now governed by that hand. Then, without transition, the second slide appeared. No fade in. No build-up music. Just a document header. Expenditure Pathways Q2 Override Memo. Underlined in red, without annotation, all temporary staff to be reclassified under Phase 3 optics. Public notice not required under interim review. A beat. Then another. Still, no one spoke. The MIC before Johnson remained live, its little green light glowing, almost mocking now. But the man behind it said nothing. He didn't reach for it. Didn't lean forward. Didn't even blink in rhythm with the flicker of shame now crawling across the room. This wasn't policy anymore. It was blueprint. This wasn't a misstep. It was a system design, uncovered not through outrage, but through stillness. And the stillness grew heavier. To the left, a senior representative shifted her pen from one hand to the other, then stopped. Let it rest beside the notepad. Her fingers curled, not in frustration, but in surrender. To the right, a political correspondent from the second row uncrossed his legs, readying for the moment that might follow. But nothing followed. No denial. No moral scramble. No voices rising to contextualize or deflect. Only the screen. Only the hand. Still up. Still open. Still enough. Camera 4 zoomed in, slightly, a lens adjustment rather than a movement. Framing Arnold not as an actor in the confrontation, but as a wall it could no longer pass. Even the room seemed to understand this was now beyond sides. This wasn't Democrats versus Republicans. It wasn't celebrities versus officials. It was silence versus machinery. And the machinery had just seized. No allies came to Johnson's defense. No counsel leaned forward again. Even the stenographer, eyes locked on her keys, paused just briefly, realizing there was nothing left to type. Then, an unplanned moment. A junior intern, seated by the chamber's rear door, stood, too quickly. Not out of protest. Out of instinct. Out of the kind of moral motion that doesn't ask for approval. But he didn't leave. He just stood. A quiet vertical line at the room's edge. A line that, in its simplicity, said everything. This is what it looks like when the system unravels itself. Back at the table, Arnold finally lowered his hand. Not like a command finished, but like a sentence punctuated. No applause. No dramatic swell. Just air. Returning to its natural state. And the folder in front of him remained closed. Because by now, no more receipts were needed. The record had already begun writing itself. Without narration. Without spin. Without rescue. Just light on paper. And silence as proof. It wasn't quiet because people feared speaking. It was quiet because the truth no longer required a voice. The slide on the screen dimmed slowly, retracting into the chamber's background light. No one moved to replace it. No aide reached for the next file. No senator asked for clarification. The air had thinned, not with tension, but with a shared recognition. This room no longer belonged to the committee. It no longer belonged to the majority. Not to decorum. Not to process. Not even to law. It belonged to presence. To stillness. To one man sitting in the seat that was never meant for him. Arnold didn't lean forward. He didn't stand. He didn't raise a finger. He just waited. And that wait, those 6 seconds, cracked something open. A staffer shifted in the back row, then stopped. One of the younger representatives, 15 feet to Arnold's left, began to reach for their MIC, then slowly withdrew the hand. On screen, the chamber feed caught it all. Not a word. Not a soundbite. Just small, accidental surrenders to something unspoken. Then came the voice. Not Arnold's. A woman's voice, from the far end of the horseshoe. A senior congresswoman with grey at her temples, a single earpiece resting but unused.